So I'm going to start by logging in, which is going to take me to the bpm'online main menu. And from here, I'm going to navigate to the System Designer page. Over here on the right, using my little gear icon. And I'm going to find Organizational Roles, which is listed under Users and Administration. We see that here. So, like I mentioned, in my example, I'm going to control the security on an account record by using a lookup that's based on different sales regions. So I'm going to start by creating a handful of organizational roles under the sales department role that comes with the system. I'll do that by highlighting the sales department role, selecting new, and entering a new division. I keep this example fairly basic. So I'm going to start with an East region, a West region, and a Central region. And I am seeing some comments that it's a little hard to read, so I'm going to zoom in a bit. Hopefully that makes it a little easier to see for everybody. So I'll save the East region. It lets me know that I want to update my roles once I finish creating roles, which I will do. But first I'm going to create the rest of those regions. So once again, I'm going to highlight Sales Department. I'm going to do another new division. This time we'll add the Central region. Go ahead and save that. And then we'll do one more for the West region. If I wanted to assign my users to these roles as I was setting up the organizational roles, I could do so here using the users detail. I'm not going to bother in this example. Keep in mind you can do that directly from the role, or you can also assign organizational roles at the user creation screen as well. Okay, so now I have my 3 regional roles set up within the system, so I am going to update the roles. And now I'll be able to find those within the System Administration Lookup, which we'll see in a few moments. My next step is to actually create the Custom Lookup Object we will be using to control this security. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to my System Designer over here on the right-hand side, and then scroll down to the very bottom where we'll find our Advanced Settings under the Admin Area header. You do have to have pop-ups enabled. Okay. So those of you who are familiar with the advanced settings know this is where you find your object permissions as well as your configuration page. It's also where you would set up the change log and control your bpm'online license management. I said when you first pull up the advanced settings, it drops you off at the object permissions screen. So this is how you set up the out-of-the-box security model within bpm'online. That's not something we're going to need to change in this example. So instead, I'm going to jump straight to the configuration tab, and we'll see a list of all of the packages I have within my bpm'online environment. So if most of you are aware, if you're a system admin, in out-of-the-box bpm'online, all of your customizations are stored in the custom package. The custom package always sits at the bottom of your package hierarchy. It is a system package. It's actually the only system package that you're able to modify without creating a new package. So that is the package we're going to be using in this example. For those of you who have changed the packages you're using, keep in mind that is controlled through system settings. If you ever need to revert back to the custom package or change to a different package, like I said, in this example, we're going to stick with the custom package and place our new object directly into the custom package. So I'm going to start over here on the Schemas tab. I'm going to do a right-click, which will allow me to add. And we're going to go ahead and add a new object. Okay. So the object we're setting up is going to be the lookup object that we're actually using to control the security. So the very first step is going to be to set our inheritance. Anytime you create a new object in the configuration tab, you do need to inherit from something, and that's what's going to give us all of our system columns, things like the ID, the created by, the modified by. In this example, we're going to be inheriting from the base lookup object, so that's also going to provide us 2 columns to start with, the name and the description column, which will both be used as part of our lookup list. So to find the base lookup object, I can simply start typing here in the parent object field. Like I mentioned, I'm looking for the base lookup object. I'll confirm that is the parent object I want to use. And then if we expand our column list over here on the left-hand side, we'll see it did pull in those name and description columns as expected. The next step is going to be to provide this a name as well as a title. Keep in mind that the name is what it's going to be referred to in the database, so it always has to include your prefix. The default prefix for BPM Online is USR for users. This can also be changed in system settings. So I'm just going to call this the region lookup. There are no spaces allowed in the name. And the title is what it'll be displayed as on the screen. So you are allowed to use spaces, and it does not require a prefix. So I'll name it the region lookup there as well. It is going into our custom package, which is correct. So we do not need to change that. And you can see it is properly set to the base lookup parent object. The one thing we will need to do that's special about this lookup is we're going to need to add a custom column. And that's how we're going to link the entries within our lookup list to the proper organizational roles. So to add a new column to this lookup, I'm simply going to right-click where it says Columns, and I'm going to add a separate lookup column. So it wants a title and a name for this new column as well. Like I mentioned, I'm going to use this to link to organizational roles. So I'm just going to go ahead and label it Organizational Roles and store it as Organizational Roles in the database as well. Anytime you are creating a new lookup column, you need to define which list it's using. So since we're looking for our organizational roles, those are found in the System Administration Object lookup list, which we see here once I start typing. Okay. So this all looks correct. I'm going to go ahead and save this new object. I do that up here in the top left. You actually want to use this drop-down. So rather than selecting save, I'm actually going to select publish, which does a brief compile. And that allows this to actually be usable. And we'll need it in just a moment once we get to the section wizard. Okay, so we can see that my object has finished publishing. I can go ahead and click OK, and then I can close this tab. It's no longer necessary. Here in my custom package, we do see that new object created, and it is placed in the custom package as expected. So like I said, let's go ahead and jump over to the account section. We're going to access Section Wizard by using the View menu, clicking Open Section Wizard. All right, so let's go ahead and click on that page tab. Like I mentioned, we'll see the edit page for my account records. And we're going to go ahead and add a new column to the account section, which targets that new lookup object. Once we save this change, like I mentioned, it's going to actually create a replacing object for the account object for me, which will automatically be placed in the custom package. You can do that manually. I know some people prefer. I just think it's a little easier rather than wait for another set of publishing to just go ahead and create that through Section Wizard and add it to the layout all in one step. So here's my account page layout. I'm going to go ahead and add this new column onto my profile card over here on the left-hand side of the screen. So I'm simply going to drag out a new column, a new lookup column, down here at the bottom under the industry lookup. It's going to need a title and a name as well. So your title is going to be your label that you see on the screen. I'm going to simply call it region. And in the database, we'll refer to it as region as well with our standard prefix of USR. This is where we control whether or not we want this to be a required field. I don't think that's necessary. You can also control the read-only settings here. And lastly, we have to point this to our new lookup object. So it defaults to select an existing lookup. So we should see our region lookup here in this list once I start typing, which we do. Some of you have probably added new lookups using Section Wizard. Keep in mind, if we did add the lookup in this manner, we would not have been able to add that extra column that targets the system administration object. That will be critical as part of our process. Okay, I'm also going to switch this to use the list lookup view rather than the pop-up window because it's a small list, or it will be a small list with only 3 entries. Let me go ahead and save that. We now see region listed under industry in the profile card. I'm going to go ahead and hit save one more time. And that's going to go ahead and publish these changes to my account page edit screen. Go ahead and hit OK. I don't need this tab anymore. And I'll jump here back to the account section. If I refresh my page, I should be able to see my new lookup. I may actually need to log out and log back in. Okay, so if I open up an account record, again, this is just dummy data that comes with the demo instance. We do see the region lookup has been created and placed under the industry lookup as part of an account edit page. There's nothing in this lookup right now, so if I click the little drop down, obviously nothing appears. And we're going to start in the process library, which of course is listed under the processes header. Okay, so when I click on process library, it's going to give me a list of all of my different business processes. I'm of course going to start with a new process. The next step will be to actually populate that lookup. So let's go ahead and go back to the System Designer over here on the right-hand side. And we're going to find Lookups, which is listed under the System Setup header. And the very first thing we're going to need to do is register a new lookup based on the lookup object we created in the Configuration tab. I'm going to go ahead and click the New Lookup button. I'm going to start by selecting the object. So if you guys recall, we named it the region lookup. I'll also label it the region lookup to avoid any confusion. I'll go ahead and save that. We see it appear over here in our lookup list. Let's go ahead and open that up. And this will allow us to define the entries as part of this lookup. So I'll go ahead and start with new. We're going to have the central region. We're going to have the east region. And we're going to have the west region. So the different columns we see here as part of our lookup, we obviously have the name and we obviously have the description. Remember, those come from the base lookup. Those are inherited from the base lookup object. So the name is what we actually see on the screen. The description is not displayed. And then we also have the custom column we added for organizational roles, which targets the system administration object. So this is actually a crucial step, is we have to link our lookup entries to the proper roles that are stored within that system administration object. Otherwise, the process we're going to design in just a moment will not function correctly. And this does work a little bit differently than some of the folks on the call as their security setup. So it's now actually being administered directly within the lookup list rather than as part of the process itself. So I can use the magnifying glass to see all of the different system administration objects, and I'm just going to look for my different roles that I've created in this list, or I can search for them up here at the top. So we have the central region. We'll want to find the east region. and lastly, the West region, of course. You may notice as I'm going through the system administration object, it also lets you specify individual users to be linked to your lookup entries. So you could potentially use a lookup to assign security to a user rather than a role. Okay, so now this is set up correctly. Let's go ahead and close. I'm going to go back to an account record just to make sure that lookup populated correctly. And then from there, we can go ahead and start designing our process. So let's look at the XT group account one more time. If I scroll down to region, we should now see our 3 entries do appear in the region lookup list. Go ahead and pick one, give the record, and check my access rights. We'll see that it has no effect currently, as the read, edit, and delete is still assigned to the all employees default role. Okay. So anytime you start a new process, it'll automatically include the terminate event as well as a simple start. We're not going to be using simple start. We need to use the signal start, so I'm just going to delete everything it has by clicking these little X's, and we'll go ahead and start from scratch. The very first thing I'm going to do is give my process a name. You can see use a very generic name, business process 1 to start. So let's go ahead and call this auto set region security. Okay. So all my process elements are controlled over here on the left-hand side of the screen. Like I mentioned, we're going to be using the signal start event, which we see here listed under the start events header. Now let's go ahead and start by dragging a signal start out onto the process window. So over here on the right-hand side, it's going to ask me what type of signal are we receiving. So we are going to receive an object signal, and the object we're looking for is the account object. So what kind of event is going to trigger this signal? Is it going to be a record being added to the system, a record being modified, or a record being deleted? We're going to set this up so it could be triggered off either a record being added or a record being modified. So we'll actually need 2 signal start events. But for this one, let's go ahead and set it to capture any records that are added to the system. Down here, we're looking for different filter conditions that the record needs to meet before it triggers this business process. So for this example, I'm just going to use a single condition that we want to read the region column on that account record. And we're just looking for that region field to be filled in. So I'm going to go ahead and switch this equal sign to it is filled in. And now any new account record that's added to the system that has the region field filled in will automatically trigger this business process. The last step is just to label this element. It makes it a little bit easier to refer back to later. So let's just go ahead and call this account created. So like I mentioned, we'll also want to capture or change the security anytime somebody modifies that lookup on an existing account. So we will need a second signal start event, which I'll place right below that. That'll also be looking at the account object. And this time we're going to be looking for records that are modified. You can see an additional field where it asks me which changes we are expecting. So I'm going to say we're looking for changes in any of the selected fields, which will of course be the region column. I can search for region, go ahead and select that, and then we'll apply those same filter conditions. So we don't want this process being used unless that region field is filled in. Okay. We'll go ahead and relabel this signal start event to account modified. Not required to relabel these. It just makes your process a little bit easier to read. Okay, so now we have 2 signal starts. So anytime an account is added to the system that has its region filled in, it'll automatically launch this process. And anytime an account record is modified, anytime someone makes a change to that region field, that'll also launch this same process. The next step is going to be using that read data element I mentioned earlier. So that's listed here under the system actions. So we're going to read some information from the account record that launched this process. I'm going to go ahead and drag that read data out onto the screen. And it's going to ask me, or let me fill in all of the settings, over here on the right-hand side. Okay, so we are going to read from the first record in the selection, and then it asks us which object we want to read data from. So we're, of course, going to be reading from the account object. And how does the system know which account we want to read information on? We define that by using filters. So this is actually going to have two conditions. We're going to start by looking at the ID of the record, and we're actually going to compare that to a process parameter by using the compare with parameter functionality. That will allow us to read the ID of the record that triggered this process. So you can see here, by looking at the signal start event for an account creation, we can read the ID value of that specific record. We'll also need to add a second condition that looks for the ID, also using a parameter of any account that was modified. The last step here is to switch this to an OR statement. So now either will be targeted by this read data. So any account that's added to the system or any account that's modified, it'll know to read the ID value, or it'll know to read information from that specific account record. Down here at the bottom, we need to define what exactly we are reading from that record. Down here where it says read data from all columns, I'm going to switch that to read data from selected columns only. And I define those columns down here. So the only information we're going to need is the ID of the account record that we'll be modifying the access rights on. And we also need to know what region it was set to via that new lookup. So I go ahead and select those two columns, go ahead and hit save, and we see that displayed down here at the bottom. You could potentially use the read data from all columns and still have that same information. It's obviously not recommended. Anytime you're setting up a business process, you should try to be as specific as possible and only read the absolute minimum required information to save on the processing power. Okay. I can go ahead and relabel this read element as well. Just read account info. Okay. So let's go ahead and connect our signal starts to the read data element by simply dragging the arrows. And this is how the process will know which route it's supposed to take. You can also drag and drop these around to make everything look symmetrical. All right. Okay. Next step is we're going to need to read the system administration object out of that lookup list. So for that, we're also going to use a read data system action. I can go ahead and drag that out onto my screen. And we'll set this up somewhat similarly. So which object are we going to read data from? This time we're going to be reading directly from the region lookup. How are we going to filter these records? Once again, we're going to be looking for the specific record's ID. And that's going to be based off the process parameter. We're looking for the region that we read earlier off of that account record. So what information is this read data element going to read? We're only going to read off of selected columns, and we're really only interested in that organizational role that's defined as part of that lookup list. So we go ahead and select the organizational roles, and we see that populated down here at the bottom. Oops. Okay. Should also relabel this, that we're reading the region lookup. And then go ahead and connect the previous read data to our new read data element. right. Next, we're going to need to actually change those access rights by using the Change Access Rights system action. So I can go ahead and drag that out here onto my layout. It wants to know which object we're changing the access rights to. So once again, we're going to be changing the access rights to a specific account record. It wants to know which record's access rights we're changing. So we only want to change a single accounts record. So once again, we're going to use the filter. We're going to build a condition for ID, and we're going to point that towards our read account info element as it captured the ID of the record that launched this process. So it's only going to change that single account's access rights. You do have to be somewhat careful when you're setting up these business processes. If you don't set up your filter correctly, you might clear or set, access rights over a large number of records accidentally or incorrectly. In this example, we're only going to be changing the access rights of a single account, whatever account it was that triggered this process to run. Down here at the bottom, it's going to ask us which access rights we want to remove. So I'm going to start by removing all of the access rights off of this record, as they're going to be reapplied in just a moment based on the region that was selected. You can choose to remove only specific users, employees, or specific roles. In this example, I think it makes more sense to take off all of the access rights and then reassign based on what we saw in that lookup list. So you also have the option of choosing whether the read, edit, or delete rights are all removed or just any combination of those three. Okay. And then we need to define which access rights we're going to add. So I can go ahead and hit the plus button. We're going to add rights for a specific user role. It's going to be one of those region organizational roles we defined earlier. Here it asks us to specify what that role is. So I'm going to go ahead and use this. We're going to use the process parameter once again. And this time we're going to look at our second read data element, which is reading the region lookup. And we're going to select the organizational role that we read earlier. Go ahead and save that. And again, we can define whether it's going to apply read, edit, or delete permissions. I think a pretty common request we have is to not allow anybody except for system admins to delete. So we're going to keep delete unchecked and just apply read and edit permissions. Okay. This could use a relabeling as well. We'll go ahead and call this set account security. All right. So let's go ahead and connect this. Squish this together a little bit. I zoomed in and my screen's a little cluttered. And then the last piece we'll need is that terminate end event, of course, which we can drag out here. And we'll need to connect that as well. Okay, so everything looks good. Let's go ahead and save this process. Hopefully I set it all up correctly. We'll test it here in just a second. Okay, so let me go to my other tab, which is still on the process library. If I go back to the account section, let's go ahead and find an account record. I'm going to use my own account, my technology advisors here. If we look at the access rights using the action menu, it should be set to the all employees role. Well, it has many. It's actually all employees as well as myself, because I was the one who created this record. What we should see is once I change that region lookup, it should delete all of these permissions and reapply based on the region I select. So like I said, I'm going to cross my fingers that I set that up correctly. And we'll go ahead and make a change to the region lookup here. Let's go ahead and use the central region. I go ahead and save this record. And recheck those access rights. It does look like it worked correctly. So it removed all of the read, edit, and delete permissions like it was supposed to, and has assigned the read permission to the central region, the edit permission to the central region, and has explicitly denied the central region from making any deletes to this record. You'll notice it does not list system administrators under delete. Keep in mind that's actually controlled through a system setting. So even though nothing is listed under delete, as a system administrator, I would still be able to potentially delete this record. Okay. Let's go ahead and change that one more time just to make sure it works correctly for a different region. Go ahead and switch that to the Western region. Go ahead and save. If we look at the access rights one more time, it should be set to the West region, which it looks like it is, which is good. If we go back to our system designer one more time, we'll check this in the process log. We should have two separate processes, one for each time we change the region, and it looks like it did complete those processes correctly. If I wanted to go back and see the execution diagram, I could. This is useful if you're ever needing to troubleshoot a process. I think a lot of times when people set these up, they can get their ID filters a little mixed up. But once again, you have to be very careful when you're building the process, especially on that change access rights element. I would certainly encourage everybody to test this on a development or a test instance if they have one available. But it did hit all of our system elements correctly. So it passed through both read data elements, it changed the account security, and then hit the terminate event, which set it to the completed status, which is correct.